Hello and welcome to episode 11 of our weekly podcast, Long Shots. And today we are going to talk about business and finance like we always do, discuss major events, trends, or often just something we find interesting, relevant, and intriguing. First things first, to our listeners, we do stream on Apple iTunes, Google, Spotify, Deezer, and I'm pretty sure on whichever podcast app that you like and prefer. So do subscribe to our channel. This is Nikhil Arora and I'm joined with Sharad Tupran. Sharad, what's up? I use your full name today.
Not much. It's good to be here as always, and it's our 11th week running, and I've enjoyed every one of those.
Strange thing about 11, you know the significance of the number 11.
Not really.
It is the Singles Day in China.
Oh, is it really? A pair of lonely ones?
That's exactly the origin of the date 11/11. It's 4 ones.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah. So before we go into it a bit deeper, what is the Singles Day?
I don't know. Shopping paradise?
It's not just shopping, man. It's the pride of being alone.
Oh, is it really?
Yeah, it's apparently a big holiday, not a big holiday, but a big shopping window in China. I think it was started by Alibaba. They pretty much pushed for it.
Oh, yeah. Yeah.
I don't know what the data is, whether singles spend more than couples, but Alibaba probably likes to agree with that.
Yeah.
You saw a few of their numbers, right?
Yeah, I know. I saw a few of those numbers, and they were quite phenomenal. Wow. I think in the first 24 hours, they did $30.8 billion US in sales.
Right.
And that's a phenomenally high number. And when you sort of compare it to the other e-commerce channels, let's call it in Indian, they really eclipse those numbers.
So you mean like the Big Billion Day and the Amazon's Great Festival?
Yeah.
How much? Do we have any comparison?
So there's a research estimate that Amazon and Flipkart combined for 2 days did, why don't you take a guess?
8 billion.
It's closer to 1.5 billion.
Okay.
And
so it's 20 times in China.
Yeah. So that's sort of the scale we're talking about. I mean, these are estimates, but clearly way ahead in terms of actual spending. And doesn't really come as a surprise, does it?
It's interesting because, and at a high level, if you look at policymakers, if you look at businesses, if you look at, entrepreneurs, VCs, they all like to go a lot about the great Indian middle class and their spending appetite, right? We always hear those numbers. And I say this because after reading about Alibaba, I was doing a bit of research and I found the quote by Joe Tsai, who's the executive vice chairman there. And he said that there are 300 million people in China's middle class. And that number will double to 600 million in the next 10 to 15 years. And that's what they are aiming for. And that's what the Singles Day success is all about.
Okay.
But I do hear strange parallels in narrative about, 300, 400 million Indians in its middle class and their spending appetite. I think everyone, like Flipkart, Amazon, Ola, Uber, Swiggy, Zomato, they all kind of go about, this segment. The numbers are impressive. But probably the second question is that, how much are they ready to, how much money they actually have? What is the appetite to spend?
Yeah, no, that's an interesting debate because clearly, I mean, I feel like it's more of a future parallel. And I think at least where India sort of as a country is at least 10 to 20, maybe 2 decades behind in terms of hitting that level of demographic when it comes to individual spend and all that.
Right.
But are there any numbers to sort of say what is the definition of a middle class? Even that itself is so subjective.
Correct.
That it's hard to even generalize and look at it from that lens without actually understanding what it means.
Right. Yeah. If you look at research, there's a lot of research lately which has happened in the realm of inequality, wealth inequality, with a focus on India. I remember Oxfam did a research, Credit Suisse did it. Then, Thomas Piketty, the guy who wrote Capital, the French economist, he wrote a paper in which he mentioned that the top 1% of Indians are actually responsible for 21% of the national income. It is pretty much the same proportion which was there in the case when the British were here. Okay. So, I mean, over such a big decade, that inequality has only, grown more and more. So, speaking of all that research, what I found very interesting was, I think it's called NCAER, one of the agencies in India. They put $10 a day as the benchmark
for middle class.
It's not a lot, right? $10 is what? $700, 20,000 rupees a month.
Yeah.
So 20,000 rupees a month of household income classifies you to be in middle class, right? And so you have to pay. You're paying rent. You probably are, commuting. You are
food and fuel,
everything. And after that, how much do you really have to actually spend on these additional, I would say, non-mandatory purchases, on e-commerce platforms, on food apps or whatever.
Yeah, so it's probably worthwhile to relook at the target market sizing.
Yeah, so Piketty actually says that 78 million Indians
Yeah.
are above the $10 a day benchmark. It's
Okay.
not 300 million.
Yeah,
It's not
yeah.
400 million. It's 78 million.
Yeah.
It's not a big number,
Yeah.
right? And $20,000 per month.
Yeah.
That's their spending appetite.
Yeah.
And then I did a bit of deeper dive into the overall demographic in India. So there was a very interesting Economist cover story a couple of months back, which kind of looked at. I mean, the title of the cover story was India's Missing Middle, and they kind of say that that if you look at top 1% of Indians, they make around $20,000 plus. That's 8 million people. Then the second bucket is around 9%, of the population, which is equivalent to Central European countries. Then the third big bucket is 40% people who are equivalent to Bangladesh and Pakistan and poorer South Asian neighbors.
Yeah.
And the remainder, which is almost 500 million people, it's equivalent to Sub-Saharan Africa. So obviously there's in this entire narrative of the great Indian middle class, it's a bit of a kind of overkill, but I do agree with you that probably businesses position it as a going concern, as something they're looking at in the future.
Yeah, no, that's a very interesting discussion, though. I definitely feel there's a time lag element, and I guess over time you will see where the Chinese middle class is right now. You will probably see the Indian middle class make that upward movement into that bracket.
So we'll include that as well.
Yeah, the only thing that I find a little interesting, it's a thought, is it's probably right now like the e-commerce giant, you say Flipkarts of the world, or even food delivery platforms who are all sort of catering to this quote unquote middle class. It's more, I guess, positioning themselves for the future when the Indian middle class sort of comes to a position where the Chinese middle class is right now.
Right.
It's just positioning yourself so that you can extract heightened value when that hits, I guess.
Right.
But time is an interesting variable. You never know of the uncertainties and certainties around it. I mean, who knows if Alibaba comes to India, who knows, right?
Right.
But I think it's all the long game. Everyone's in the long game. So let's see how that happens.
But I mean, it's not just business leaders and entrepreneurs who pretty much use the concept of the great Indian middle class to position their businesses, right? Obviously, they are kind of pitching to VCs. Many of these VCs are, not based here, so they have probably they're probably more optimistic. They're less cynical than the setups which are here. But what's interesting is also how policymakers, use this data and this narrative on a very frequent level. I mean, I remember, wasn't it electric vehicles in which when China announced its 2030 something target to become EV focused country, I think Nitin Gadkari also announced a similar target. Yeah, by 2030 we'll become electric vehicle compliant. So he was kind of comparing the Indian infrastructure to the Chinese backend infrastructure like for like,
which is not at all
which is not at all the factual reality, right? I mean, China obviously is fairly ahead when it comes to the EV value chain.
Yeah, and since we're talking about EV, I think we wanted to dig a little deeper as well. So why is there so much noise on the EV side of late? I mean, I've been reading a lot on EV and sort of people talking about reselling of power and how things around that are becoming a little loose and flexible. So what's the story there?
Actually, I mean, when it comes to electric vehicles, there are, I think, some basic fundamental concepts that one should be aware of. Firstly is that when it comes to an electric vehicle, the upfront cost usually is higher than an equivalent ICE vehicle, but it's the total running cost which is lower. So there's a concept of called total cost of ownership, which is basically what you pay upfront plus what you pay in the long term.
Yeah.
The latter is pretty much, things like how much you spend on recharging, what is the maintenance, which in case of EVs is fairly minimal because there are hardly any moving parts.
Depreciation and all that.
Yeah. So that is much lesser. So the idea is that, like what people feel is that when the total cost of ownership of EVs will actually be equivalent to ICE with similar performance, that's the inflection point when people are going to start buying.
Yeah.
Right? But there are people who are even more conservative. They say that no, people don't really understand the concept of a total cost of ownership. They actually want the upfront cost to be lower.
Yeah.
So for upfront cost to be lower, basically you need in-house battery technology because batteries form a big component of that. And then for actually bringing down the running costs, you need a solid charging infrastructure.
Yeah.
So the recent news was regarding the charging infra, because I think what was happening was that a lot of EV businesses, who are manufacturing these vehicles, are keen to also set up charging stations. But the current rules are not permitting them to do that.
Is that because of redistribution of electricity?
Precisely. So there's this thing called the Electricity Act, which forbids anyone to resell electricity from utility companies at the retail level. You need a license to do that. So any individual cannot really do it. You need to be like a licensed distribution company.
So this is very interesting. So you're saying that as per the Electricity Act, you cannot redistribute or resell from main distributor and at an individual level, but those are being relaxed just for the entire EV ecosystem to thrive better.
It seems to be like that. So basically,
that's pretty interesting.
Yeah, the concerned minister, he made a statement that there's a new EV infrastructure policy which is coming, according to which these licensing norms will be relaxed, and individuals and non distribution oriented businesses would be free to set up charging stations. So that obviously is expected to give a big boost to the back-end infrastructure required to make at least the long-term running costs of EV low.
That's pretty interesting because I was, like you said, the power and renewable energy Mr. R.K. Singh. He also, I read a quote from him that he's trying to come up with a plan to install EV charging stations at every petrol pump.
Right. Yeah, I think that's one of the ways they're going to kind of.
I found that interesting. I mean, not without any numbers behind it, but just optically, it seems like that if I pull into a petrol station and I do every other day, there'll be a charging infrastructure as well. It obviously, reminds me every day that what. You can go the Tesla route. Right.
I mean, and there are some pieces of innovation when it comes to charging, which are, I think, pretty India-centric as well. Like I forgot the name, but there have been a few companies who are thinking, instead of putting a charging infrastructure, why not just replace batteries, at designated points of time. So you go there, you park your car, you switch your battery. So the battery becomes like a rental lease item.
That's a pretty interesting business proposition.
It's a very kind of so-called quote-unquote jugadu approach towards a lack of infra.
Yeah.
But I mean, that being said, I don't want to be way too optimistic, because this is just a small cog out of this. A lot of other things need to fit in order to make India 100% or 80% EV compliant nation by 2030.
Yeah.
I mean, and this is just a first small step in that direction. I mean, I think the industry is waiting for emission standards. They're waiting for standardization and manufacturing standards. Because, without that, nobody's going to actually set up a massive assembly line and scale it up.
Yeah. And even from a consumer standpoint, given that we've just established how prolific our middle class is,
yes,
it's not going to intuitively happen overnight.
Yes.
Considering you just said that the upfront cost is the more sensitive variable here.
Yeah.
So it will take time from all supply and demand side.
Precisely, yeah. So from the demand side, I mean, it might take like 10-15 years for it to pick up, as we discussed earlier, right? But for the supply side, these boxes need to be checked.
Yeah, no, that's a pretty interesting discussion, and obviously very topical across the world in terms of renewables and electricity and all.
And pretty much, I mean, in India, anyways, the government is big.
Yeah.
And for a nascent industry like this, policy actions at this stage play a much a larger role. And I mean, when it comes to the government, I think they can really move and shake things on an accelerated basis when they. I mean, I find it very interesting because a lot of times Western economists, and especially like the guys who are based in the US, they always comment that the US government does not really matter. I remember when Trump was being elected, people used to say that it doesn't really matter. The US economy is so big that the White House has a very small role to play. But I don't think in India that's actually correct. Its government is a massive employer. They are a big policy driver. And
they try to enforce their views on RBI.
Yes, exactly. They try to enforce their views on everything, including the RBI.
Yeah, which I think is an excellent segue into our next little segment.
Yes. This was not at all by purpose, that. Yeah. This was completely organic. Natural.
Unscripted, as you say.
Yes.
No, I thought it's
so first things first, what are we talking about? We're talking of RBI and government in what context?
We're talking...
Let's be not subtle now.
We're talking about, like I think it was in August that RBI paid out 50,000 crore dividend to the central government.
Right.
And there was some discussion around it because the government now is pushing back, saying like, you know what, 50,000 crores is extremely conservative. There is room in the balance sheets to do more.
Right.
And I think the number they were sort of quoting, I mean, this has been a speculated number, was 3.6 lakh crore, which is about 7 times higher anyway.
Right.
So, which has opened up an interesting debate from a technical standpoint and from a philosophical standpoint. From a technical standpoint, how much is it that RBI can give in terms of back to the government? They anyways do the surplus, they give the surplus. But in terms of reserve management, what is the right level of reserves? And second is from a philosophical side, does the government even have a say on deciding, you know what, we want more or we want less? Is RBI completely at their authority to decide, you know, how much they need to preserve? But that's a debate, and you've been following it as well, and we were talking about it as well. So what do you think about it? Like, there are obviously so many different angles to talk about here, but let's briefly first, I guess, spend like 20 seconds on the technical aspect of it, and then we can just philosophically discuss. I mean, if it's such a subjective discussion anyway.
Right. Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, I think I would first talk a bit about the second part of your question in terms of does the government really have a say? I think they do have a say at some level. I mean, even though RBI is an autonomous institution, but it is still accountable to the government.
True.
So if the government asks the question, that conversation needs to be had.
Agreed.
I mean, obviously the way it is being framed out, that's a different debate altogether. But yeah, I think the question is a fair question to ask, right? Well, that being said, it's a fairly, I think central banks have a very different model versus commercial banks, right?
Yeah.
So RBI has an income statement. They have a P&L, they have a balance sheet, right? And they do have an income. They mainly invest, they buy financial assets, you know, they buy government securities, treasuries, they have a huge amount of gold reserves, right? So all of that, all of those assets, financial and non-financial, generate some sort of an interest income, right? So that's where their income comes from. And if you look at their expenses, the biggest I won't say the biggest expense, a major expense that they have is printing costs, right?
Yeah.
They print a lot of currency notes, right? A little bit too much in 2 years ago, obviously. But yeah, and the actual single largest piece of expense they have is something called a provision charge, right? Which is slightly different from a bank provision. So if you look at a commercial bank, they provision for bad loans. But in case of RBI, they provision for managing or stabilizing macroeconomic shocks, right? So they charge a significant amount of provision, and then they capitalize that provision on the balance sheet as a surplus reserve. Right? So every year they adjust the reserve, and if the reserve goes up, there is a charge on the P&L. If the reserve goes down, there is a benefit on the P&L. So I think the entire debate is about how much reserve they should keep. Because the dividend is paid after this reserve has been deducted. You know?
Okay, that makes sense.
Yeah.
So I was reading, from the government standpoint that, right now RBI holds about 27 or 28% of their reserves as surplus.
Of their assets, right?
Of their assets as surplus versus some other countries who hold like between 10 to 13%.
Right.
And using this argument as a suggestion that there's a lot of room for higher payout from the RBI standpoint, like is that argument sound in your view?
Probably, yeah. I kind of know. I mean, it's not really like for like, right? Because it depends on which countries they're looking at.
Yeah, I think some of the developed countries are in there, Singapore, US, and
so
UK.
So there you go, right? I mean, there is a different. I mean, every country has a very different macroeconomic profile and structural dynamic, right? So, I mean, for instance, in case of India, there are a couple of very clear reasons which lead to macroeconomic shocks, right? There's monsoon, there's oil, exactly, and depreciating rupee, you know, and because we are kind of import dependent. So, I mean, I remember, I think the $500 billion of FX reserves which RBI holds, that is part of the surplus, right? Which went down by like $100 billion ever since oil went up. So, yeah, they do need it, right, in some form or the fashion. So, I don't know whether a percentage comparison that, 27 is too high because, you know, other countries are doing it at 13. Probably that's not the most, like for like sound way.
So, like along those lines, is there a structured way then?
Well, they're not really. I mean, if you look at the RBI's annual report, they have kind of mentioned something along the lines of a surplus distribution policy in which they give three possible ways of looking at it. I won't go into the details of what individually they are,
Yeah.
but the interesting way they sign off that section is that they kind of say that, the provision requirements should be linked to the target level of financial resilience. I mean, I don't know
Subjective.
the answer to that.
Yeah.
It's a very broad statement to make, but it does appear the fact that they are not ready to opt for a clear formula means that they want to have some sort of a leeway, and because they do recognize that in case of the Indian economy, such kind of contingency funds are often deployed, and they would rather have it in their remit than just transfer it to the government. The forthcoming meeting, November 19th, I think that would be interesting to see what comes out of it. I mean, even though such kind of topics cannot really be resolved over one meeting, pretty sure a lot of things are going on behind the scenes.
Yeah, no, definitely worth interesting to keep a close eye on. It should be quite meaningful in terms of because of all the noise that RBI has been under in the last 2 weeks.
Yeah.
So it should be an eventful board meeting.
Oh yeah, definitely. I mean, I don't know, Shar, do you feel that in the last 2 to 3 years, such very technical financial topics, they have become such mainstream, in terms of discussion? I think that was post demonetization. Before that, I don't even remember these things like RBI's surplus or financial resilience being discussed in mainstream news, but now it's everywhere. Probably people are now much more aware of it and much more interested in knowing more about it.
Yeah, no, I think I agree. And a lot more eyes closely watching the Indian economy as well, I feel.
Yes.
So it requires to be addressed.
Correct. Well, on that note, I think it was a great, a very multifarious discussion as usual, and would like to remind our listeners that if you like this podcast, do feel free to rate it, subscribe, like it. If you don't like it, do not really, feel the urge to comment. It's okay. You can just move on with your life. That's always a good idea. But yeah, I would encourage you to, give your feedback as much as possible. And on a side note, we do run an online news company by the name of Transfin. Do check out our website. There's a lot of interesting, articles, opinion pieces, explainers on that related to business, finance, and consumer-oriented topics. So do check that out. And yeah, with that, we can sign off. This is Nikhil.
And this is Sharath.
Signing off.